this is Karin from the YA Library, and today we're going to be making moss terrariums. And the first thing that we have to do is harvest some moss. So I am standing outside in my front yard and I am going to go hunting for some moss, which I think we'll find right at the base of this tree behind me. So I'm going to switch this around and show you. It's a pretty nice day for looking for moss. This tree has a whole bunch of different kinds, it looks like. I am not an expert moss identifier, but I see at least a couple of different species here. There's some right over in that area, and then there's this sort of more compact clump over here. Which one should we take? I think I'm going to go for this fluffier moss here, and I'm just going to take a little piece right there. I don't know if we can put, maybe we should put 2 species in the moss terrarium. I'll take the other one too. Oh, this one's a little bit harder to get. It's going to come with a little piece of bark as well, it looks like. Okay, so I've got some moss for my moss terrarium that I'm going to bring inside. If you don't have easy access to moss on your own property, you can ask a friend or a neighbor if maybe they have some that they wouldn't mind rehoming for your project. Don't collect it off of forest preserves or conservation district lands, because that is against the law. Harvest your moss responsibly. Moss likes to be kind of moist, so I've put mine on a wet napkin. You can use a wet paper towel. Just make sure it stays wet while you are assembling the rest of your supplies for your moss terrarium, so that it will be happy once you've moved it into its new home. Okay, so I've assembled all of our supplies to make our moss terrariums. We've got our moss that we collected earlier, and you're going to want to rinse your moss a little bit just to make sure that you don't have any friends in it. I have a very active little worm that I found in my moss, which has been crawling around on my finger here, so I'm going to put him or it back outside so it can keep doing its wormy things, but not inside my terrarium, because there won't be any dirt in there for the worm to root around in. So we've got our moss, and then this is some pea gravel that I have in my garden, and I just rinsed that off really well with water. I don't recommend using soap because that can leave a residue which might not appeal to your moss. This is some Spanish moss that I got from the craft store, which we're going to use to make a layer in our container. And then I just have a mason jar here that I'm going to use for my terrarium. And you want to have some kind of container that has a lid so that you can keep the environment contained in there. So everybody say goodbye to our little worm friend. This is really like the most active worm I've seen in a while. And then we'll get started making our moss terrariums. The idea for the moss terrariums came from another librarian out there. Her name is Jessamine West, and she has a website where she displays all of her different moss terrariums. She calls them mossariums, and the website is mossarium.com. That's mossarium.com, and her name is Jessamine West. So we've got all of our supplies here, and we're ready to get started. This is actually pretty simple. You're going to take your jar or your container, and you want to have enough of these small rocks, pea gravel, to make a layer inside of this jar. I'm going to move my moss over real quick, and we'll put the jar front and center. Okay, and then we're just going to put the rocks in. I think I collected enough. You can find these at places like Home Depot or Menards or Lowe's in a big package, or you could use aquarium stones, or you might just have lots of rocks in your garden. The people who lived here before me used pea gravel for something, and so I had a lot of it just kind of laying around. I only have a few rocks left, so I'm going to put those in too. Okay, so that's my layer of gravel or stones. And then On top of that, I'm going to put this Spanish moss. So this is going to be messy. I'm going to take it apart a little bit and then stuff it down in here. We've got like maybe 1.5 inches of the gravel on the bottom, and then I would like about the same for the Spanish moss too. It's kind of springy though, so we'll make it do as best we can. So you don't need a whole lot of that either, so if you've got it left over from something else, great. If you can borrow a little handful from somebody, unless you have a really huge container that you're putting your moss terrarium together in, you won't need a whole lot. Okay, so you're also going to need some water, and you're going to fill your container up to the top of the Spanish moss with water. So let me get a little bit of water to do that. I'm right next to the sink, so just make it nice and easy. So here's my water pitcher, and I'm just going to fill my jar up. Can you see it? The water is kind of sloshing around in there, filling it up to the top of the moss. My moss is starting to float here. This is the non-growing moss. Okay. And I might have a little bit too much water in there now, so if you have done like I have and have too much water, you can add a little bit more moss to it. And then we'll just push that down in there until it is flattened somewhat. Looks good. And then I have my moss that I harvested earlier from the base of my tree that I extracted a worm from earlier. So here's my moss. This is the growing moss, and you can see what it looks like underneath. It's little fronds. And I'm just going to arrange my moss in my jar on top of the Spanish moss. And then I've also got this little clump of moss that's more tightly formed than that one is. And it's happily growing on top of this piece of bark. So I'm going to remove it from its bark. Sorry, moss. So that it has better contact with the water here in the Spanish moss. And I'm going to leave, let's see, this one still has a tiny piece of bark attached. I'll leave this one and see if I can get the bark down into the water. Whoops. Placement is kind of difficult when you're working with a jar that you can barely get your hand into, so be aware of that. If you have a really small opening on your container, you may need to use some pliers or something to help you, or tongs to help you place your moss down into the jar. Quick rinse of my hands here. You can see the moss down in the jar. And if you've got some moisture like on the walls of your jar, I have a little bit of moisture here from where the water, or where my hands were wet and sloshed the moisture around a little bit. You can take a paper towel or a tissue and wipe that out. I've got a napkin here, and I'm just going to wipe off that extra moisture. You might get some condensation in your jar anyway when you close it up because of the moisture that's in there, but you don't want to leave it open to the air too much because all of that moisture will drain out and then your moss will dry out and it won't be happy. So once you've placed your moss in your jar, I'm going to move this down so you can see a little bit better. I've got the moss in the jar on top of the layers of the rocks and the Spanish moss, and it looks pretty happy. Hello, moss. Then you can put the lid on your jar, like so. Mine is a canning jar, so it's got this flat lid and then the part that you screw onto it. And then you've got your little mossarium, and you can put this, it doesn't need to be in bright sunlight, but in indirect sunlight is good so that it gets a little bit of light, but not too much, so you don't want it to get sunburnt. That can happen to plants sometimes. And your mossarium is ready to go. You can make all kinds of different varieties and test out different mosses and see how they like it. You can put other decorations in there, like maybe a stick or some bark, and see how those do. You want to be careful with some kinds of material because things can rot, and then if the jar is closed up like this, the rotting produces, or the decomposition of whatever's in there can produce gases that are either stinky or can pop your jar lid off, so that could be dangerous. So be careful of what you put in there and monitor it. If the water level in your moss starts to go down, you can add a little bit, maybe check and fill it every month or so just to see what's going on. If your moss is getting, or if your jar is getting too much sunlight, you might have algae growth in here too, so it might get super green, and in that case you might want to pop your moss into another jar and clean off your rocks and stuff and start over if you don't want it to become too green. If you like that effect, then leave it there. I hope you had fun making mossariums with me today. For more fun ideas and other craft projects, check out our website, www.huntleylibrary.org.